Welcome back, everyone. In the last video, I challenged you to set up the category selector and migrate the category context code to the appropriate place where we're fetching our categories map. So what I want to do is I want to walk through this with you when it comes to thinking about where we want to put this fetching, especially this API external fetching code inside of your code base. So some of you might have moved this into your app.js, likely where we had previously our subscription to the auth-state change listener. Technically speaking, there's nothing wrong with doing this, but if you think about it, the app component does not actually need this categories map data. The first component that actually needs this categories map is actually our shop page. Inside of our shop page, we have categories preview and category. Both of these components, the category preview needs categories map, and the category component needs the category map. So their nearest ancestor is the shop component, and the shop page component can actually be the one that fetches the code from our categories context, which is to fetch the Firebase API, get down all those documents, create the categories map. So we can actually copy over and paste in that use effect that we had before. We'll of course have to tweak some of these so that they work in the context of Redux instead of in the context of our context API. Forgive my use of the word context here. In order to do that, we need to start bringing in the appropriate methods. So first, let's bring in our use effect hook from React. Let's also bring in our get categories documents from our Firebase utils. Let's go up to our utils file, Firebase utils. And then we also need our newly created set categories map action creator. So let's bring in set categories map. Going up to our store folder, categories, and then categories action. So this, of course, is an action creator, which means we still need our dispatch, which comes from React Redux. And then it's just a matter of using this hook to get the dispatch and then wrapping it and calling it on set categories map. So there we go. Now, of course, at this point, we do still have access to our categories context. So this category component and the shop component are still hooked up to that. But if you look inside of this state object, we do see that we do have the appropriate categories reducer with the correct categories map. So now what we need to do is start using it. The first thing I want to do is I want to remove references to this categories context inside of index.js. So here, what we can do is just delete the categories provider. And the nice thing about this is once you remove it, your code will stop working because you no longer have access to the context. But what you need to do now is figure out where in your code you're still calling categories context. So clearly here inside of our preview component, as well as inside of our categories component. So first, let's start removing any references to this context because we're no longer using use context. Instead, what we're doing is we're using our selector, which we have not made. So inside of our categories selector, let's create a const select categories map, which is equal to a function that gets state. And then from the state, we pull off categories map, like so. Let's make sure to export this. Import this now into our categories preview component. Going up to our store folder, categories, category selector. And then from React, we no longer need use context, but instead we need use selector from React Redux. And we'll just say, okay, I want to get categories map by calling use selector with select categories map. There we go. So here, now this categories preview should be properly selecting categories map. So what we can do is we can go to the shop page and we see that we indeed have our data. But going any deeper, we notice that we have nothing. So this is exactly as expected. We have not migrated over the category component. So let's do that now as well. I'm just going to copy this because I know this is pretty much a one-to-one change of what we need from the category component. So instead of this, I'm going to put this in. I need use selector. From React Redux. And of course, I also need select categories map from our store folder, our categories folder, our category selector. Let's save this. And now let's go back. And there we go. Our code is now properly migrated over to using category context. And we can now delete the categories context.jsx. And as we see, nothing in our application breaks because everything is now properly migrated to Redux. So I know there is just a lot of this kind of redundancy that we're going through where we're writing selectors, we're writing reducers, we're writing our action creators, we're bringing in the use dispatch, the use selector hooks. But this is all very important because so much of this is indeed boilerplate and setup. But the main benefit that we get, of course, is going to be still the unidirectional data flow, single source of truth for all of our data. And here now, as you practice and the more you code this, you will naturally just be able to infer all of the steps that you need and you'll understand why they're necessary. You need actions to actually create updates in the reducers. You need selectors to pull that data down. And then you have to set it all up inside of the appropriate store object. So all of this is just a cyclical flow that you have to get familiar with. But now that we've set this up, there's a couple things that I want to talk about. And that has to do with some of the more optimizations we can make to this setup that we have, now that we have two different reducers, which we'll discuss in the next video. So join me in the next video, and let's talk about optimizing this code.